There are quite a few numbers on the stats page in Battlefield 6, and the game isn't really clear about what they actually mean. I did a few videos already on the mobility stat to try to figure out what that one means, so go ahead and check those out if you're interested. Today, though, we're going to be looking into the Hipfire stat. The Hipfire stat is a little bit easier to understand than mobility because it quite obviously affects what happens when you fire from the hip, but what I'm looking to answer today, though, is how do the stat and the respective attachments actually affect your hipfire? It's not as straightforward as you might think, and I think that I found some interesting stuff, so let's get right into it. We'll get the obvious thing out of the way, and that's that the hipfire stat obviously affects the spread of your weapon when you fire from the hip. So this reticle here in the middle of the screen will get larger as I get the lower hipfire values, and it will get smaller as I get the higher hipfire values. Let's start off with a sanity check then, and let's make sure that two guns with the same hipfire stat have the same hipfire spread. So what I'll do is I'll take the M4A1 here with a hipfire stat of 46, and I'll shoot this wall until we form a nice circle of bullets that we can inspect. You'll notice that if I fire full auto, I get this huge amount of recoil. The reticle actually in the middle of the screen expands a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep it simple by firing one shot at a time. And what we're going to do is you'll notice that if we fire one shot, our reticle perfectly resets to exactly where it was before. So we can use that to then get a more controlled test and get an idea of what these hipfire spreads look like. So you can see that I'm standing 10 meters away from this wall, and I'm going to fire a single shot at a time as I mentioned, and we'll see what happens with the circle that I make of the spread whenever I shoot this wall. Alright, so I think that's enough bullets for us to actually get an idea of what's going on here, and the first thing that we can learn is that, well, obviously the hipfire is going to make a circle on the wall, and you can see that the bullet pattern that I've left falls basically to the inside of the reticle here. So if you look at the three prongs, I mean, I guess if you have your weapon on full auto, you'll get 4 prongs. If you have it on semi-auto, you only get 3, but the pattern that was formed here essentially falls to the circle that's formed by the inside of the 4 exterior lines on our reticle here. So the first thing we learn here is that when you're firing from the hip, all of your bullets that you fire will be contained by the inside of the 4 lines that make up your reticle. Remember though that we wanted to check and make sure that two guns with the same hipfire will have the exact same hipfire spread, so our M4A1 here had a hipfire of 46. If we switch over to an assault rifle, the M433, and we have the red laser on it, you'll see we also have a hipfire of 46. So we'll equip this, and we'll repeat the same test that we just did. Once again, I think that's enough shots. We basically have a full circle here. So the thing I'll mention here is that most of these are not going to be a perfect circle. If you fire infinitely many shots, you'll get a perfect circle. But if you're firing only a finite number of bullets, then you're probably bound to get some spots that just by chance don't end up having a shot hit them. But you can see in general here, if I move over, that these are essentially the exact same patterns. We get roughly the same diameter of the circle that's formed. So that kind of confirms for us that two guns with the same hipfire do appear to actually have the same amount of hipfire spread. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the M4A1 and equip a variety of attachments to give me different hipfire stats, and I'll repeat some of the tests that we just did, and we can observe how the spread changes with our hipfire stat. I have the 6 hipfire spread patterns on the wall in front of me, so let's take a look at them, and first off we can notice a few things. For one, obviously the tests with lower hipfire have more spread than the tests with high hipfire. The interesting thing, though, is that this doesn't appear to be a linear change. The difference between the 2 lowest hipfire tests looks much higher than the difference between the tests with the 2 highest hipfires. If you look over on the right, the 2 circles on the right are almost exactly the same, whereas the 2 circles on the left are very noticeably different from each other. So I think we maybe need to quantify this and get some actual numbers, and how we're going to do that is by processing some screenshots of these patterns here. So I know that the distance between 2 metal posts on this wall is about 2 meters, so we can measure from a screenshot how many pixels there are between the posts, and that will allow us to determine the ratio of meters per pixel. If I then take that ratio and multiply by however many pixels wide the circle of spread is, then we can use that to actually determine the size of the circle itself. Now, spread in Battlefield, or in any game for that matter, essentially just functions as a triangle, whereas if anything is point blank with your gun, it'll have no spread, and then as you get further and further a distance away, it'll spread out even more. So essentially what we need to find out here is the angle of our spread cone, and we can find that out by using just a little bit of math. So I know that I'm standing 10 meters away from the wall when I did these tests, and I know the radius of the circle that I just mentioned, so we can make a little triangle here and then use the arctangent between these 2 values to calculate the spread angle. I did this for many tests of different hipfire stats, and I produced this plot right here. So this plot represents the spread angle as a function of your hipfire stat, and as we visually observed when we looked at the spread patterns, the relationship between hipfire spread and hipfire stat stat is definitely non-linear. For really low hipfire values, increasing or decreasing your hipfire stat makes a large change in your hipfire spread. At high hipfire values though, increasing or decreasing your hipfire stat doesn't actually make a huge difference. We can fit this to an exponential line and you can see that the data suggests that hipfire scales roughly with your mobility stat raised to the negative 1.88. Now obviously, when you're playing the game you're never going to be thinking about that, but it does give us some insight on exactly how they are related. For the sake of simplicity, let's say that it scales with your mobility stat raised to the negative 2. And the thing to think about though is that what actually matters most when it comes to your chance of hitting a target is not the angle or the diameter of the spread circle, but it's actually the area of the spread circle. The area is related to the spread angle squared, which means that this is essentially related to your hipfire stat raised to the 4th power. I know that this is kind of a lot of math, but what does that actually mean? Well, if you have a gun with a hipfire stat of 22 and you increase to 44, the chance of you hitting something with a single shot actually improves by a factor of 16. Or likewise, if you go from 44 to 22 hipfire stat, your chance of hitting a target actually decreases by 16 times. So really you can see here how hipfire attachments are actually much more meaningful on guns that already have really low hipfire stats like LMGs. But okay, so now we see how the hipfire spread changes with the hipfire stat, but how do the attachments in Battlefield 6 actually impact the hipfire stat? Because it seems like sometimes when you put on a laser, it changes by, 6 or 8 hipfire, but if you put that same laser on another gun with a different hipfire stat, it can change it by a totally different number. While it seems like the hipfire stat functions very similarly to a lot of the mobility-related stats, where there's actually a hidden layer of hipfire levels that the stat number is abstracted from. So every weapon in the game has a base level of hipfire, and attachments move you up or down a certain number of levels. Most attachments seem to move your level by multiples of 2, so the red laser, for instance, moves you up 2 levels of hipfire, and the 5 milliwatt green laser moves you up 4, and the 50 milliwatt green moves you up by 6. The short barrel also moves you up 2 levels, while the suppressors, except for the CQB suppressor, move you down by 2 levels. The only attachment that seems to not move in multiples of 2 levels is the flashlight, which will move you up only a single level. There is, of course, also the SMG proficiency on the engineer class, which says that it improves hipfire control when using SMGs, and it looks like that one gives you 2 levels of bonus as well, so it's essentially a free red laser when you use an SMG on an engineer class. So because of the fact that there's kind of like a hidden layer of levels means that a lot of attachments actually just either stack perfectly or cancel each other out perfectly. So for instance, the light and suppressor, which lowers you by 2 levels, and the red laser, which increases you by 2 levels, will cancel out perfectly to give you the exact same hipfire stat as if you had neither of these attachments equipped at all. I think that this actually does give some interesting depth to the choice of muzzle and laser attachments, because light and suppressor plus red laser will have the same hipfire as CQB suppressor and no laser, but it costs 40 points compared to 30, but it does also come with recoil improvements, so there's actually quite a few things to consider there. Meanwhile, light and suppressor plus green laser will have the exact same hipfire stat and point cost as CQB suppressor plus red laser, with the only downside being the visibility of the green laser. So there actually is some decent choice making there in what qualities you prefer out of these attachments, because essentially every single attachment scales the hipfire the same with the exception of the flashlight, so it's very easy to work out in your head which things will cancel out or if you'll actually be getting any bonus at all. Now of course, most people don't just fire one bullet at a time when they hipfire, they hold down and spray. So let's see if the hipfire stat affects the spread while firing full auto as well. So to test this I'm going to do similar things as before, but it's a little bit more difficult because now I have to deal with recoil. From our earlier test though, we know that the hipfire spread is indicated by the inside edges of our reticle, so what I can do is fire at a wall and then just measure the size of my reticle similarly to how I had done before. So as I shoot, it eventually will go up to a maximum size and I can measure that size to actually get an idea of what the diameter of the hipfire spread is. I can then also just calculate the angle and everything the same way as before, so I'll skip all the fancy stuff and we'll just show the plot here. So this one is once again interesting because it obviously isn't linear, and from the fit line it looks like your max spread while firing scales with 1 over your hipfire stat. The thing that's a lot more interesting though is if we look at the ratio of the hipfire spread areas between max spread and minimum spread. So minimum spread is obviously when you're standing still and fire your first bullet, whereas maximum spread is after you've been firing full auto for a little bit. So what this will tell us really is how much less likely are we to hit a target at full auto versus just bursting or firing one shot at a time. And this plot reveals something really interesting because the ratio between max and min spread is actually a lot smaller when your hipfire stat is low. This means that for a weapon that has a bad hipfire stat like an LMG, there isn't much of a point to burst firing hipfire because the spread isn't really penalized a ton by firing full auto. For high hipfire weapons though, the difference in spread area between max and min spread is different by almost a factor of 16. So that means that you're essentially 16 times less likely to hit a target with hipfire firing full auto with one of those weapons than you are by bursting. So for weapons with a high hipfire stat, bursting hipfire is actually really effective at range because shooting full auto actually comes with a pretty big penalty. And you can intuitively feel this in gameplay as well because when you take a gun with a high hipfire stat, like this SMG right here, which has a hipfire stat of 80, you can hit targets at really far ranges by burst firing from the hip. You can see I can take out this target quite easily, whereas if I try to full auto him, it takes a lot more shots before I actually take him down. Meanwhile, if I take a gun with a really low hipfire stat, bursting doesn't really do much because my hipfire spread is so large, and if I full auto, I'm still not hitting really any shots. I got 1 out of the 39 shots that I just hit there. The last thing that I'll mention here that's not actually related to the hipfire stat itself is that your recoil actually does affect your hipfire as well, because if you take a gun with no recoil attachments, like right now I just have basically a base M4 and I shoot it full auto, you can see that the reticle just kind of jumps around a lot, whereas now I'll go ahead and I'll equip some attachments that reduce my recoil. And with these attachments that reduce recoil, if we now shoot at the wall, you can see that it's a lot more controlled and it really bounces around like a very noticeable amount less. So as I mentioned, it's not part of the hipfire stat itself, but it actually does affect your shooting from the hip. So to summarize everything from this video, we learned quite a few things about the hipfire stat. First, changes to your hipfire stat make a huge difference when the stat is low, and make a relatively small difference when the stat is high. So increasing your hipfire stat from 70 to 80 doesn't make much of a difference compared to increasing it from 30 to 40. This means that on guns with really low hipfire like LMGs, you can actually get a lot of value out of the lasers because you're going to get much more of a benefit for a relatively small point cost, whereas on an SMG, you're not going to get as huge of a benefit. Every gun has a baseline level for hipfire, and the attachments move you up or down these levels, so they don't actually change any specific percentage value of your hipfire. It just matters on what level you are because each level has a preset value. The hipfire stat number is just an abstraction from these levels that doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to me. It seems like a lot of the stats in this game are just abstractions from hidden under layers of levels. What's important though is that these attachments can perfectly stack or cancel out, so a suppressor and a red laser combine to give you no change to your hipfire spread. And a red laser plus a short barrel will give you the exact same benefit as just having a 5mW green laser. Finally, your hipfire spread increases as you fire, but the amount of increase varies based on your hipfire stat. Weapons with high hipfire have a much larger increase in spread than weapons with a low hipfire stat. This means that burst firing high hipfire weapons is much more effective than firing full auto, whereas there isn't much of a point to burst firing with a low hipfire weapon because the penalty from full auto isn't that bad. Hopefully you guys learned something from this one today. Let me know what you think of these findings in the comment section below. I encourage you guys to test some of these things out for yourself as well, and let me know if you come to the same conclusions. I have been wrong before, such as with mobility, and I can only make conclusions off of the data that I have available, so cross-checking with others can help be sure that these findings are actually correct. Make sure you subscribe for more Battlefield 6 content. I definitely plan on looking into the control and precision stats in the future. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.